Imagine for just a moment that the zombie apocalypse has just suddenly hit the country of North Korea. Now envision yourself being stuck in the Hermit Kingdom during this global calamity. Could you survive a zombie outbreak in the most isolated, secretive, and authoritarian country on Earth? What would be the best and worst locations to survive? And just how difficult would it be to survive in this dystopian nation on a scale from 1 to 10? The answer to those questions, and many more, are coming right up in this needlessly detailed thought experiment. With that being said, let's quickly cover some facts about North Korea before we delve further into this analysis. North Korea isn't a particularly populous country, as its estimated total population is only 26.6 million. Now, in order to understand just how unimpressive that figure is, let's look at the estimated population of the United States, which currently stands at roughly 347.2 million people. As such, North Korea's population is about 13.05 times smaller than America's population. The US state of Florida literally has a similar population total as North Korea, as the Sunshine State is currently home to roughly 23.3 million Americans. As a matter of fact, the Indian cities of Mumbai, Delhi, and Bengaluru, which are India's most populated cities, have a combined population of 28.9 million. That's right, just 3 of India's many super cities house more people than fucking North Korea. So, at face value, North Korea doesn't seem like a terrible place to be during the zombie apocalypse. But when we look at the authoritarian nation's population density, we see a completely different picture. With a population density of 571.94 people per square mile, North Korea isn't nearly as bad as India. But it is, without a doubt, well above the US average of 98.3 persons per square mile, and it's also greater than the global average of 155 persons per square mile. And when we look at a heat map of North Korea, we'd see that the greatest concentration of the Hermit Kingdom citizens live in and near the capital, being Pyongyang. So one can only imagine just how bad the population density is in that particular region of the country. No doubt, North Korea is fertile ground for a zombie outbreak. That being said, North Korea's active duty military manpower is estimated at being roughly 1.3 million in size, hence representing 4.8% of the nation's total population. This force is further reinforced by the regime's paramilitary units, with estimates suggesting this civil defense force is roughly 5.7 million strong, thus representing an additional 21.4% of the total population. Together, both active-duty militaristic forces comprise 26.2% of North Korea's entire population. So, on paper, the DPRK seemingly has the firepower to squash a weak zombie uprising and maybe even the strength to survive a seriously bad zombie outbreak. But there's plenty of other factors pertaining to the regime and its military forces that we'll have to cover later in this video. Now, gun ownership within the borders of North Korea is virtually non-existent, with only hunters and law enforcement being permitted to utilize firearms. So the only real way you'll ever have access to guns is by ripping it off the corpse of a soldier, hunter, or cop. Good luck with that. Be that as it may, I wasn't able to find any information regarding the general or average IQ of North Korean citizens. This is precisely because of the deeply secretive and isolationist nature of the Hermit Kingdom. So, all I can really say is that the average North Korean skills will be based on their government-mandated occupations. All able-bodied men in the country have also, at some point in their life, undergone rudimentary training as conscripts. It also cannot go without saying that just about all of these people are going to be suffering from a lifetime of nationalistic indoctrination, and also fear of the state. So, it would be safe to say that the people of North Korea could be both a benefit to your survival and maybe even a hindrance to it. It really just depends on the situation. Setting all of that aside, one simply cannot talk about North Korea without at some point talking about the regime. The fat, limp-dicked, oompa-loompa looking head-ass dictator of this oppressed nation operates a total police state where citizens are literally monitored on their phones, monitored via widespread security camera usage, monitored by undercover agents which blend into normal society just to keep tabs on any potential dissenters, and they're even monitored in their own hotel rooms, which are almost always bugged. The regime is so repressive that North Korean citizens can't even leave their village, town, or city without first being granted permission. And before you even ask, yes, each municipality in North Korea has highly controlled checkpoints which regulate the entry and exit of its own citizens. As you can imagine, the regime also enforces severe punishments for even the smallest of crimes, often sending people to concentration camps, which are euphemistically labeled as being re-education facilities. North Korea also practices the art of generational punishment, where violators of North Korean laws may also see their family punished for their own crimes, often for several generations. There's also a literal social credit score. That's how bad it is in North Korea. Now, I mention all of this in order to point out a simple potentiality, being that if the zombie outbreak has a clear and defined epicenter, and if the zombies themselves aren't much of a threat, then it's actually quite possible for the regime to crush the undead uprising before it gains any traction. And this is precisely because of Big Brother's all-seeing eyes. But if the zombie apocalypse happens everywhere at once, and or if the zombies are undead super sprinters or even special infected, then odds are the regime won't be able to stop the spread in time. Especially if zombies overrun Pyongyang, which would literally decapitate most of North Korea's leadership structure. Now, under such a scenario, the regime would prioritize the safety of its dear leader, while also aiming to preserve the very power structures the regime relies on to enjoy the privileges it has garnered off of the backs of the people it's oppressed for generations. This, in turn, would likely lead to a scorched earth campaign where entire villages, towns, and even smaller cities are purged by the North Korean military. But this campaign would not be easy to implement because most of the DPRK's military forces are actually deployed along the 38th parallel, also known as the demilitarized zone or the border with South Korea. As such, a rapid deployment to Pyongyang would not be a quick or easy endeavor for the regime. Nevertheless, if the regime doesn't stop the outbreak early on, it'll definitely become a threat to you, whenever it begins to purge society in a desperate attempt to secure its own survival. And in the long run, when the regime fully collapses, you can bet your sweet ass that rogue military units and leaders would form violent paramilitary communities. However that may be, perhaps North Korea's infrastructure, topography, ecology, and climate might just redeem it in this apocalyptic thought experiment. When it comes to infrastructure, North Korea's capital has excellent roads, an excellent power grid, first world quality water treatment, sanitation, and distribution systems, plenty of railroads and subways, and even a fairly pollution-free environment. But all of this changes once you leave Pyongyang. The rest of the nation is often plagued by blackouts due to its pre-industrial era power grid. Rivers and lakes are often polluted by industrial waste, mining runoffs, fertilizers, pesticides, and even fucking raw sewage. But remarkably, there are plenty of areas in North Korea which are so sparsely populated that the rivers and lakes in those regions are actually quite pristine. Now, if you're not in a major city, you're going to be stuck with good old-fashioned dirt and gravel roads, which doesn't sound like a big deal at first until it rains and your vehicle gets stuck in the mud. Assuming that you can even get your hands on a functioning vehicle outside of Pyongyang. Did you know that some estimates place car ownership in the DPRK at a dismal 1 automobile per 1,000 persons? That's fucking crazy. North Korea is also infamously known for being a food insecure nation that has often been plagued by famines which were a direct result of piss-poor authoritarian management, deforestation, the terrible climate, and also because of the simple fact that North Korea doesn't have a lot of arable land to work with. Reports have literally estimated that just 19 to 22% of North Korea's land is arable. As a matter of fact, roughly 80% of North Korea's territory is mountainous, and the winters in the Hermit Kingdom can get as cold as negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing, albeit the southern regions closer to the southern border only average around 23 degrees Fahrenheit to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The rest of the year is actually quite comfortable though. In any case, the climate of North Korea is surprisingly seasonally diverse, with June through September being the monsoon season, which is obviously characterized by a ton of fucking rainfall and both hot and humid conditions. This is when those dirt and gravel roads become mud-choked, when rivers flood, and when lowlands may become impassable due to them being largely submerged in water or just being turned into a muddy clusterfuck. Sometimes the eastern coast is also afflicted by flooding and small storm surges from the remnants of typhoons. Now, from October until April, North Korea experiences its frigid dry season, which means little precipitation for crops, with the only rainfall coming in the form of cold snow. If the zombies can freeze, this just might be your favorite time of year. Now, if they don't freeze, this is probably the time of year where your run ends. When it comes to North Korea's topography, you'll be happy to know North Korea has roughly 1,200 rivers, with most being small, short, and mountain-fed. Now, the most notable rivers are the Taedong, Yalu, Raesong, Chongkong, and Tumen rivers. There's also hundreds of more tributaries and seasonal streams. The DPRK also has roughly 200 to 300 bodies of fresh water, like lakes, hydroelectric reservoirs, and man-made water retention ponds. So, if you have access to a decent boat, you could use these bodies of water for safe navigation. That being said, roughly 80% of North Korea is plagued by forested mountainous terrain, which would make navigation and both mounted and dismounted movement incredibly difficult and physically taxing. On the other hand, the lowlands, where most of the arable land and population is situated, is pretty flat and easy to traverse. And obviously, depending on the season, this topography may throw additional challenges your way. When it comes to wildlife, your biggest threats will be bears, wild boars, the Korean viper, and, in extremely rare cases, lynxes and wolves. When it comes to insects, you may occasionally run into ticks, spiders, and mosquitoes. But the insect problem wouldn't be nearly as pronounced as it would be in more tropical regions. Oh, and yeah, there's plenty of wild deer to hunt in North Korea, at least on paper. Like, it's clearly not enough to feed all of them. So, right off the bat, I'm designating the Greater Pyongyang region as the absolute worst location in the DPRK for a zombie apocalypse. 3 million people live in that city, roughly accounting for 11 to 12% of the nation's total population. It also happens to be the capital of the regime, and being anywhere near the regime when shit hits the fan is just asking for trouble. The next worst location would be the DMZ between South and North Korea. You might feel safe with the heavy military presence around you, but when the regime starts ordering civvies to get shot, you're gonna get cooked. And if you try to run to the south, you'll likely get blasted by North Korean troops, blasted by South Korean troops who might be trying to quarantine the outbreak in the Hermit Kingdom, or you might just end up stepping on one of the 2 million plus landmines along the border, and thus get blown to fucking bits. But even if you manage to get safely into the south, things probably would be worse, as South Korea has more people and a higher population density than North Korea, and most of that is lined closely to the border with the DPRK. The next worst locations would be the cities of Hamhung and Cheongjin, as these are the most populated cities in North Korea right after Pyongyang. Then there's the northern border with China. Not as militarized as the DMZ, but I can guarantee you that China won't want you crossing their border. Then there's also the brutal winters and rough terrain in said northern region, which is sparsely populated, meaning shelter won't be readily available unless you build it yourself out in the wilderness. Without a doubt, the best location in North Korea would be Kirin-do Island, which is to the south of Pyongyang in the South Hungwai province. It's sparsely populated, has plenty of farmland, plenty of trees, and has access to the ocean for fishing. Also, the closest North Korean coastline to this island is sparsely populated and likely poor as fuck, so the odds of survivors sailing over to your little island home is fairly low. The next best location would be the massive Imnam-dam's reservoir, which is located in the Gangwon-do province. That right there is plenty of fresh water in one of the least populated regions of North Korea, and it's also a southern region, which helps to dampen the rough winters of the DPRK. Just clear a tiny village on the coast of this lake and you should be just fine, so long as you can hunt for food or fish on the banks of this reservoir. But generally speaking, if you can make it to some of the smaller islands off the coast of North Korea, or if you can make it to the Gangwon-do province, you should be fine. And if you're well equipped for winter survival, and also have experience with surviving out in frigid temperatures, then you might just do fine in the sparsely populated and mountainous northern regions. Now obviously, the type of zombies involved in this hypothetical apocalypse would affect the difficulty of survival in any region, but I'm ranking North Korea based on a set of criteria that scales universally to any zombie apocalypse. So overall, I would personally rank the difficulty of surviving a zombie apocalypse in the DPRK at a 9 out of 10. For starters, I just don't see the regime crushing most zombie apocalypses in fiction. As such, the regime itself would be a major threat to your life during the initial outbreak, as the regime will do whatever it takes to secure its own survival, even if that means purging entire villages, towns, and cities. Now, in the long run, the surviving remnants of the regime would also likely be a threat to your survival, unless they somehow accept you into their ranks, but even then you risk being killed by a rival warlord's paramilitary forces. If you're in Pyongyang, Hamhung, Chongqing, or Wusan, you're likely cooked due to the large hordes of those sizable cities. Finding decent firearms and plenty of ammunition would also be difficult, which makes defending yourself against the undead, against other survivors, and hunting even more difficult. You also likely wouldn't have access to vehicles, fuel, or quality survival gear. The infrastructure of the DPRK also mostly sucks, and the food insecure nation already struggles to keep everyone fed. So, odds are, even if you can survive the regime, the zombies, and the hordes of desperately violent survivors, you'll likely starve anyway. Brutal winters can help if the zombies freeze, but if they don't freeze, the frigid winters actually hurt you even more. The terrain of North Korea is also horrendous, as it's extremely mountainous. Rivers and valleys are prone to flooding and even flash floods. There's also always the chance that you get bodied by bears, wild boars, and even mountain lions. And, worst of all, there are no good escape options when you're stuck in the Hermit Kingdom. Exfiltration into China is difficult across the Yalu River and also across mountainous terrain. But why bother, as China would be bad during a zombie apocalypse anyway? It would also be insanely difficult to make it across the DMZ between South and North Korea. And even then, South Korea is probably even worse for a zombie apocalypse than her northern cousin. Escaping into Russia via the Tumen River would also be difficult, but it honestly would be the best option considering the lack of population in that particular region of Russia. But said region is not exactly teeming with food, shelter, or good weather either. There's also no real good ocean escape routes, as the closest Japanese coastline is 500 to 550 miles away. And even then, Japan is not great for zombie survival. And the closest Chinese coast is where China's population density is at its worst. Now, if the zombie apocalypse is just regulated to North Korea, odds are the world would easily quarantine the nation, thus preventing your escape. So yeah, North Korea would absolutely suck ass during a zombie apocalypse. Anyways, if y'all like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell as well, that way you may be notified when I publish a new video. And always remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined down in the comments section. I'm Captain Gold, and I hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.